What is stress? Well, stress is your physiology. That's your autonomic nervous system, which means the system of your nerves within your body. So there's a lot of talk about the vagus nerves and what this does and how it works in your body. So I'm going to show you a really simple format, and this is how I explain where we're at in the therapy room with my 5, 6 and 7-year-old clients. So maybe you want to use this as teachers, as therapists, and with people that you know. This can be applied to stress all the way through to trauma, and this is literally your physiology 101. Taking a look at the Motorway of Wellness. The reason it's called the Motorway of Wellness is because this is a way of understanding stress and trauma through a very simple lens, looking at a motorway of where your nervous system goes during the day. I use this with my clients who are 5, 6 and 7-year-old just to explain how they're doing in the therapy room and where their nervous system actually might be in that moment. So feel free to share this among friends, colleagues, teachers, therapists, and hopefully it's a way to understand your neurophysiology 101. So as this is a motorway, you're going to be looking at lanes. This motorway is literally a conduit, which means it's the place in which travel occurs, and it's not responsible for the issue, okay? Quite a lot of times I hear people talking about the vagal tone and the vagus nerve as though it's the nerve that's actually at fault, and this is actually incorrect. So one of the reasons I'm bringing this to you is to show you that it's about the traffic, okay? So if we take the traffic and we assume that during the day, what happens is our nervous system has a usual up and down kind of mode. What you might find is that we use a mixed state, and this means we might take another area, say for example our mobilise system, and we might incorporate it and we might play. Now the thing about the vagal brake, as it's called, is it prevents us overshooting and ending up in what we call the hyper-aroused zone. We might choose to be settled and rested, and we might choose to be intimate. Now this doesn't mean having sex or being in a place where we're actually looking at being with our partner like that. It's actually about closeness, quietness, stillness, and this is actually where repair and digest takes place. Again, the vagal brake prevents us going into the hypo-aroused zone. Now, as with all motorways, you might find that there are variants of different traffic. And one of the things to bear in mind is that we're not responsible for other traffic users, we are responsible for ourselves. Sometimes, in the case of stress or trauma, we might find that another vehicle, so this might be another person, knocks us with their physiology, and we might find that we end up in a zone that we didn't really want to be in. Conversely, it might happen the other way. What we can do as the adult is we can try and remain and stay in our safe and social zone, okay? Keeping aligned with where we are. Sometimes other people may be in their hyper state, and again, we might want to go up, match their emotions, match their physiology, match their nervous system, regulate them, and bring them back down into a safe and social zone. And this is what you can do as teachers, therapists, or parents. For some children, they find it very difficult to be able to regulate themselves in these fairly safe zones. And I'm going to show you what that might look like. For some children, their safe and social zone is much, much smaller than everybody else's. And they don't have the particular vagus brake in the same way that we do as regulated adults. And quite often, these are the children that you might notice tend to be in their hyper-aroused state. Here, behaviours might look like their aggression, there's a lot of shouting, there's a lot of mobilisation behaviours. Other children may go into the hypo area. These behaviours look like dissociation, withdrawal, depression, quietness, and where they zone out. Our job as therapists, as practitioners, as parents, and as adults with and around the children is to help them build this zone. What might look like an ideal physiology is having a very clear, safe and social zone with an ability to move into play and intimacy and occasionally, where it's needed, mobilise and return to the safe zones and again withdraw or shut down and withdraw and come back into the safe and social zone. As therapists, we hope to increase this green zone, which we call the window of tolerance for children, or for our adult clients to make a point there. So how can we understand this physiology? Well, one of the things I like to do is show the children how we came to be the human beings of today. And we evolved from cold-blooded animals, often seen as the reptiles, which quite often we tend to talk about in terms of the brain. And this reptilian system is all about shutdown. And it's a physiology that keeps these animals safe. It's also known as feigning death. Throughout evolution, we then began to develop as mammals. And these mammals are warm-blooded. They also have aggressive tendencies, which I'm sure you have seen in some of these animals. One of the things that distinguishes animals from humans is the ability to speak. And this is where our safe and social zone came along throughout history. We were able to develop the capacity to talk to each other and to regulate each other. And for some people, you can actually see, even on their faces, that they can actually denote whether they are safe and social just by the wrinkles and crinkles on the face. So what does this have to do with the body? Well, quite often, you might notice that your physiology explains to you where you are in terms of your nervous system regulation. And what this means is you might find that you now begin to understand the theory in terms of language such as dorsal vagal, which means below the diaphragm, and ventral vagal, which means above the diaphragm. And what you'll notice is these areas tend to correspond to parts of the body. Dorsal vagal is where we withdraw, we have those gut feelings, and on occasions, we might reference how we feel in terms of fear. So there is quite a famous saying about people nearly wet themselves in fear, and that's because this is the dorsal vagal area. When we mobilise, we need to breathe faster, we need to mobilise, we need to get our heart rate going and get blood to the muscles. And this is why ventral vagal is often seen as being the sympathetic system up here, and this system being the parasympathetic. So this is beginning to use some of the terminology from the polyvagal theory so that you can see where this is in the body. What you might notice is actually this is what some of your clients or the children present with, where they have particular ailments that might be related to their physiology. For example, they might feel out of breath. They might have tummy ache, which is generally how children tend to speak. And what we need to do is try and build people back up into an ability to talk from their safe and social zone, using their senses without becoming overwhelmed. So this is sight, taste, touch, and it all relates going up to the brain. Hearing. Hopefully you can begin to understand how and where these parts are and around the body, and what your client or your child might be telling you, and how you can then relate this to the vagal system. Toxic stress, trauma. You may use some of these words to describe what's happening in your body or that of the child that you're working with. You might have seen the video, The Motorway of Wellness. But if not, I'm going to explain how the nervous system works in an easy to understand, visual proper way. So when I'm talking to my 5- and 6-year-old clients, we talk about what happens in their nervous system and how this affects them. So first of all, I'm going to introduce you to the safe and social system, which is the face. We can tell how somebody else is feeling based on their crinkles and wrinkles, how they look, the prosody of their voice, the prosody of their voice, the prosody of their voice. And we may react how somebody sounds. We might also react to their body language. So I'm going to introduce you to the nervous system as it comes away from the face. This is important because this is called the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. And these are important in terms of how our body reacts and what you might notice a child says to you in terms of how they feel. Children aren't always great at being able to explain what's going on, so what they do tend to do is they talk about parts of their body. So to help you understand this, I'm going to show you one of the props that I have with my children. First of all, we have part of the throat, which is part of the safe and social system. And obviously this contracts and changes when we have our prosody voice. Then you will see that we have the heart and lungs. This is the area that's attributed to the sympathetic system. This is the fight, flight, freeze system. And this is about energy in the body and getting the blood pumping. It also helps us pay attention to what's happening around us. When we start to look at the parasympathetic system, we're looking at subdiaphragmatic. That means below the diaphragm. So what you'll find is this is the stomach, the liver, the kidneys, the intestines, the genitals, all the way down to the bladder. Quite often you might notice that children talk about a gut feeling, that they felt like they could wet themselves, or perhaps that they feel breathless or something's pressing on their chest. This helps us understand what's going on in the body, and this is how the polyvagal theory helps us understand our physiology. However, there's one important factor, and that is all of this information that travels up to the brain, 80% of it is what we call afferent. And when it reaches the brain, it's the brain and the body together that makes sense of the information. So I'm going to show you what the brain's like. So the brain doesn't actually come in these colours. It is, however, made up of two halves. The two halves talk to each other and they have a connective tissue in the middle. And it's through that connective tissue that we're able to make meaning and sense out of what's happening to us. It's almost like we tell ourselves a story and we use words to explain the images that we're encountering at the time. Now, in terms of the part of the brain that we're going to talk about here, we're really interested in the lower part, which is called the cerebellum, and this is called the diencephalon. You don't need to know that. You can explain it to children as the lizard part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that's really interested in staying away from danger. It stays away by running away or shutting down. More often than not, it will shut down. This is the early part of our brain to evolve, and this is the one that keeps us alive because it controls breathing, sleeping, eating, thirst, and some of the other drives that you'll encounter when you become an adult. Above this, there is the system called the limbic system. Again, you could call it the mammalian system. And quite often I talk to the children that I'm working with that it's like a little mammal, and we might look at a cat or a dog or perhaps a bush baby. And I'm going to explain why this bush baby is so important. So the information that comes up from the body comes into the brain through this gateway. And it's this lower part of the brain that makes sense of what's happening to us. The bush baby could be representative of the amygdala. And this is an area that's often called the fear centre, which isn't actually true. It's more like a centre that looks at whether something's familiar or not, and whether we need to take action on it or not. The amygdala is more often controlling motivation. It also is looking at communication between people. The amygdala is very, very complicated, but we'll keep it simple. It's essentially health and safety, Ofsted, and the fear regulator. Above this, we have the area of the brain that we call the cortex, and this is the thinking part. So just behind your eyes is what we call the central processing unit, which makes it sound a little bit like a computer, and that's true, and that's the area that makes sense of what's been happening in the body. The difference is it's half a second slower than the lower part of the brain. So quite often, we might find ourselves doing something, reacting, and half a second later, making sense of what we've just done. The important part about the vagal system and the brain is they both work together, and it's this gateway here and the lower part of the brain that's really, really important. And the most important part for you as an adult working with a child is this area does not have language. So quite often we cannot use language to actually help a child within this area. we have to use the area that I talked about at the beginning. This is the area called the safe and social system. This is where we can help regulate a child through prosody, through being calm, through going and collecting them from where they are. And by that I mean, in the motorway, we perhaps move into the same lane of traffic, we collect the child, we let them know everything's going to be okay through our voice and through our body language. We don't need to tell them because they're not going to listen. When we're in a state of danger, the area that controls language and understands this isn't working quite the same way as it does when we're in a regulated state and coherent. Hopefully, this is going to help you understand some of the children, some of the adults that you may work with as well, in terms of their reactions to stress, toxic stress and trauma.